Okay, so I'm not gonna talk my way through every strategy that I'm gonna use here. I'll talk to you about the new stuff. I'm gonna show you a little bit of my workflow here. I'm gonna borrow the neck because the neck is essentially the uh, same group of shapes that I want to use for my arm or my shoulder. Now the size might not be exactly what I want, and so again, I'm just gonna kind of eyeball these and and the values of these. I was able to adjust its position along Z, and because I'm modeling this in the center of my 3D space here, I know that it's pretty easy to line these things up. So I wanted to duplicate and move my neck, and I didn't. I think I copied it. I didn't paste it, so I'm gonna undo here and get that neck back in place and make sure that I Command C and Command V. And now I see that in the Object Manager, I got a copy of the neck. I'm gonna call this arm for now, and I'll just do that same thing. So I'm just moving this over, and I'm gonna rotate it 90 degrees, and I could look down here, and again along the Z-axis in my world space here, if I zero out that value of Z, it pretty much lines it up with the torso. Okay, now I could have just eyeballed that and gotten it pretty close. I'll move it out just a bit so I could make a few changes. So I'm going to grab that inside sphere and I want to make that a little bit bigger, and I'm just going to focus on the numeric values here and probably round them down to something pretty comfortable. Looks like that'll fit inside that bracket that I made. And I'll move that out, and that's probably the length that I want for the upper arm. I'll keep this sphere, I'll probably make it a little bit smaller. Let's try 13, maybe 12. Okay, so now there's kind of a little bit of a natural taper in that design. Okay, now when I start modeling this, I want to, or as I'm modeling this, I want to keep it in more or less a neutral position. Okay, so I'm going to model this thing with its arms sticking straight out. Okay, and it's going to look kind of awkward, but the idea is I don't want to pose this thing while I'm modeling it. This arm is eventually going to fall not straight up and down. It's not going to be straight out. It's going to kind of be in a more relaxed position, but that relaxed position, I don't want to set that position until I get this thing modeled at the very end, because that might end up at a really awkward angle, and getting things to line up precisely at strange angles could be a little bit difficult. And so that's why you might see some character sheets or some 3D models that are in this really kind of stiff, rigid position, standing straight up and down with their arms stuck out to the side, like they're getting ready to fly like an airplane. And that's really kind of establishing a neutral position for modeling. Once you get that established, there's a rigging process that you can go through, and we'll do that in really simple terms by the same thing we did with the lamp, which is moving the registration points or the axis points around the area that you want major objects to rotate, and then group these things or nest them, build a parent-child relationship, so that when you move the upper arm, the lower arm's going to move with it. So that when you move the lower arm, the hand travels with the lower arm. We'll do just a really basic basic rig. So that's going to be my strategy here. I'm going to keep the arm pointing straight out. I'll jump back to my sketch and just kind of look at, and I got an idea of what my arm's going to look like. Again, there's kind of another tapered shape. I could use a comb, but there's really, not only is it taper, but it kind of bulges a little bit. So there's kind of a gradual bend to it. And so I got a couple of different strategies. I know that I could probably lathe something. Let me just jump into a new document. I always feel it's better to do some modeling in its own in an empty document. And so I'm going to look at the front view, and the reason I want a front flat view is that I'm just going to really quickly grab a freehand spline, and I'm paying close attention to where the y-axis is, and I'll just kind of freehand this rough shape. Okay, do something like that. Okay, this is like more or less the basic shape that I want for that lower arm. It's more or less kind of like a housing for the lower arm, and so I could just kind of tweak this a little bit, but that's pretty close to the shape that I think that I want. That's just the spline, right? So I'm going to go back to the perspective view. I'm going to go into my NURBS menu, and I'll go to lathe, and I'll drop that spline, and okay, Okay, so it's a little, now that I see it in the 3D shape, I think it's a little too tall. I'll turn that lathe off just so I can see the spline. Make sure the spline's selected, and I'm going to use the live select tool to grab some points. I'm just going to make it a little bit shorter and a little bit more narrow. Let's try to approach it from the other side here. I was getting a little kind of a little bit of a kink. Yeah, see, I'm getting it over here, and I really want to avoid, if I can, really just kind of getting in here to control these individual points if I can, but I don't think I'm going to be able to. I don't think I'm going to be able to avoid it. Let's see. Okay, so I could stay here and I could kind of noodle with this thing and really just get that shape that I want inside the lathe. Let me turn that lathe back on. Okay, and that could actually, that might do a decent job. So, and I'll just experiment with this. I'm going to take this lathe object, I'm going to Command C to copy it. I'm going to go to Window and jump back into my robot, and I'll paste. Obviously, it's just way too big. So let me just kind of scale this object down. I'll move it over, and I'll rotate it. So I'm not actually going to use this, okay? But I'll pretend like I'm going to use it for a minute, just because, again, this is just one strategy. We know how to lathe stuff. Okay, and that might give us more or less the complex shape that we want. Okay, so this is one solution, and I'll just call this lower arm. And another solution might be a little bit easier. I'm going to go back and borrow my untitled document. I'll get rid of this information that I have, and I'll show you another technique. So I'm going to create a cylinder, and I want to get this thing to bulge, and maybe I could do this with a cone as well. There's a really great set of deformations inside Cinema 4D, and if you look at the icon where we get the lights, the environment icons, that's lighting and cameras and floors and all kinds of stuff like that. Just to the right of where you get lights, there's this icon, this purple icon, and these are all deformations, okay? And this allows us to take rigid geometry and bend it and twist it and do some things to it. Now, there's a couple things that we have to keep in mind when we do this. We can take a simple shape like a cylinder, and we can go to deformations and grab a bend, okay? Now, the way that this works is that the deformation has to be a child of the object that it's going to affect. So it's kind of the opposite of NURBS. So I have a deformation, I want it to affect the cylinder, and so I need to drop the bend on the cylinder, okay? So now if I select the bend, I can go down to the object attributes, and I can adjust some of the values that I have here. Now when I adjust the strength, you can see that there's a bend happening, and it's actually bending the cylinder, but it's not really bending it the way that I would have expected it to bend. Okay, so I'm playing with the strength value, and I can play with the angle at which it's being bent, but it's not really, it doesn't look like it's bending the cylinder. Well, the reason it's not bending the cylinder, I mean, everything's working, it's actually affecting the cylinder, but if I turn off the bend for a second and I'll just look at the cylinder, there's no height segmentation in this object. So all of the geometry, all the resolution in the geometry is around the rotation segmentation. Okay, so this object has rotational segments. There's 36 of them, but it only has one height segment, okay? And when we try to bend this thing, there needs to be more information in the geometry. There needs to be more segmentation along the vertical, the y-axis, or the height. So if I just bump up the segmentation, the height segmentation, there's now more information in this model that could effectively be bent. So if I turn the bend back on, I'll select the bend, and now I'll go to bend strength. Now when I bend that object, and if I bend it really far, you can start to see the geometry in this object. Okay, and you can actually start to see that this is one segment that's being bent. It happens to flatten out because there's 2 points here. There's a point here and a point here. If we were to look at this through a wireframe view here, and let me just change this display to, we'll do quick shading with lines, or let's do wireframe. if we're looking at the wireframe here, we can actually see the segmentation and see how it's bending this object. So if I go back to my perspective view and I select the cylinder, the more height segmentation I add to this object, the smoother that deformation is going to bend it. So you need to keep in mind that when you play with deformations, you definitely want to have segmentation in your object so that it can be affected, and it's really easy to kind of go overboard with it. This object now has a tremendous amount of vertical segmentation, and even though it looked really good when it was bent, because of that vertical segmentation, you are going to start to pay a price to render something like that because there's just a lot more geometry in the object. So keep that in mind. And you know, my goal here, I'll get rid of this cylinder just for a second and recreate one. My goal is to actually use a cylinder or maybe a cone. I'm going to add a little bit of height segmentation in here, and instead of doing a bend, I could taper this object. Now that doesn't really do a whole lot for me because I could probably achieve something very similar to a tapered cylinder with a cone. Now you'll notice that the taper itself, it's more gradual. It's kind of a drop off here. So there is kind of a nicer taper than you would get with a cone. It looks like more of like a rocket cone. Okay, and so that's one thing. And I'm going to keep the taper there, but let me just turn it off for a second. There's another one in here somewhere. There it is, bulge. This might be kind of cool. So I could take that bulge and I'll just bump the strength up. Okay, and you can start to see that I can more or less get that that bulging shape that I originally wanted to. So let me see if I can apply two different deformations, and right now I have a bulge and a taper, and I'm being a little kind of dramatic about the application of both of those so you can see that very clearly. But that is going to give me a lot of control in creating the shape that I want. Okay, and the nice thing about this is this cylinder is still a parametric primitive. So that was a cylinder to get started with, and I can still adjust the height segmentation, and I'll reduce that a little bit because I just don't need that much information. I can still play with, you know, all the segmentation. I can still play with the height of the object, and I got a lot of control over this. So I would recommend, just like I'm doing, creating a new document and playing with some geometry and some of these deformations and see what's possible. So with that, I'm going to copy this object over, and we'll catch up in the next presentation.